Tonight, we're not going to a battlefield. We're stepping into a grand hall. Candlelight flickers across polished goblets, music drifts softly through the air, and the aroma of roast meat and warm bread fills the room. But something feels wrong. The host is smiling just a little too much, the servants are watching you a little too closely, and the wine has a peculiar aftertaste. In the Middle Ages, battles were brutal, but banquets were something else entirely. A poisoned goblet, a bull's head on the table, a toast that becomes a death sentence. Because in this world, the closer you sat to your host, the more likely you were to die. Tonight, you'll hear the stories they whispered about for centuries, the betrayals hidden behind bread and wine, the nobles who smiled and then killed. Now, turn off the lights, settle in, pour yourself a drink, and don't worry, I promise, I didn't poison it. If you enjoy this kind of quiet storytelling, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if your heart says yes. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love knowing who's out there, drifting into the story with me. And let's begin our journey. In the high castles and echoing halls of medieval Europe, danger rarely arrived with a trumpet or a drawn sword. More often it was served with a smile, garnished with herbs, and poured into a silver goblet. For the nobles of the Middle Ages, accepting a dinner invitation was not a simple gesture of courtesy. It was a calculated risk, a potential death sentence wrapped in ritual and fine linen. Oddly enough, many nobles had better odds of survival charging into a battlefield than sitting down at a banquet. On the front lines, at least they could see their enemies. They could hear the clash of steel, feel the adrenaline of combat, and, most importantly, trust their instincts. But in the candlelit ambiance of a noble feast, the lines between friend and foe blurred. Laughter could mask lies, and the sweetest wine could conceal the bitter bite of arsenic. It was a time when honor and hospitality held sacred meaning. Bread was blessed before being broken, and wine was poured with reverence, seen as both nourishment and sacrament. Yet within this same atmosphere of ritual and respect, betrayal flourished, like mold beneath the surface of an old tapestry. Feasting, once a celebration of life and fellowship, had become a silent battlefield, where political ambition was the real weapon, and poison the preferred blade. Consider the symbolic power of a wax-sealed invitation. To be summoned to a lord's table was a sign of status, of inclusion, of belonging within the intricate dance of court politics. But in certain cases, such an invitation was less an honor and more an omen. There were always subtle signs, servants who stood just a little too close, their hands resting lightly on sheathed blades, wine that held a strange metallic tang or an unnatural sweetness, a conversation that suddenly turned cold, careful, heavy with unspoken intent. Among those who navigated these perilous banquets, whispers of caution circulated like ghost stories, stories of nobles who never returned from dinner or who died in agony before dessert was served. It wasn't uncommon for the most ambitious courtiers to carry secret antidotes hidden in their cloaks, or to insist that servants taste every dish before they dared take a bite. And yet, even these precautions could fail. The true masters of medieval murder knew how to time a poison perfectly, delayed just enough to leave the banquet, only to collapse in their chambers hours later, far from the suspicious eyes of the court. There is something deeply ironic in how this sacred act of hospitality became one of the deadliest weapons in a noble's arsenal. Hospitality was a cornerstone of medieval life, a divine obligation passed down through generations. A guest was to be protected, cherished, even if he had once been an enemy. And yet it was within this very trust that betrayal struck most cruelly. When a nobleman raised his goblet in a toast, he might be lifting it to his own execution. When he smiled at the host across the table, he might be meeting the eyes of his killer. The battlefield was loud and chaotic, filled with banners and cries and the roar of horses. But the dining hall was quiet, refined, civil. There was no clang of swords, only the soft clink of goblets, the gentle hum of lute music, and the polite laughter of courtiers. Yet death could be just as swift, just as certain. What made these banquets so dangerous wasn't just the poison, it was the psychology behind it. A feast disarmed its guests emotionally. It lulled them into a false sense of security. Surrounded by friends, family, and familiar faces, one's guard naturally dropped. And that was the perfect moment for treachery to strike. For the hosts who plotted murder, the banquet was the ideal stage. Every detail was choreographed: the seating arrangement, the timing of courses, the selection of wine. A good host knew not only the tastes of his guests, but their habits, their weaknesses, and their fears. He knew who would eat what, who would drink quickly, and who liked to toast often. A deadly dose could be slipped into a specific goblet or dish, or shared among several, sowing confusion and terror. The victims, often men of pride and power, would resist showing weakness even in their final moments. They might cough discreetly, smile through their pain, or continue the conversation even as their hands trembled. Dying in front of one's peers was a public humiliation. Many tried to preserve their dignity to the bitter end, choking down their last breath with a smile, or clutching their stomach in silence as the poison took hold. It's no wonder that nobles began to view banquets not as celebrations, but as tests of survival. Dining became an act of bravery. Attending a feast meant exposing oneself to invisible threats from supposed friends and allies. It meant risking one's life for the sake of diplomacy, appearance, or political necessity. And yet, they kept coming. Because in the medieval world, to decline a noble invitation could be seen as an insult, or worse, an act of rebellion. This dangerous dance of deception played out across Europe's grandest halls and most humble keeps. It was a performance repeated through generations, perfected with every death. And while battles made the history books, many of the most important power shifts occurred over roasted game. In the end, the medieval banquet became a symbol of both civilization and savagery, a place where the veneer of culture hid the raw brutality of ambition, a place where trust was a luxury, and survival often depended on little more than luck, caution, and a strong stomach. So, the next time you imagine a medieval feast, picture not just the music and laughter, but the quiet glances, the trembling hands, and the poisoned goblets raised in deadly toasts. For in that world, dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a gamble with death. There's something almost poetic about the way death moved through medieval dining halls. Not with the clash of armor or the whistle of an arrow, but in silence, subtle and sure, disguised as sweetness. Those who mastered the art of poisoning were not mere killers. They were performers, illusionists, even artists. Their stage, the banquet table. Their canvas, the human body. And their brushstrokes, honey, wine, rare herbs, and deadly intent. Take the case of Emperor John VIII Palaiologos, a man who ruled over the crumbling remnants of the Byzantine Empire. In 1448, he attended a lavish celebration honoring recent military victories. The atmosphere was festive, the food plentiful, the wine flowing freely. No one suspected a thing, least of all the emperor himself. The first sip of wine was a little sweeter than usual, a curious thing, but hardly alarming. By the second course, his fingers began to tremble. By dessert, he was convulsing violently on the polished marble floor, eyes wide in disbelief as his advisors sat still, their expressions carefully neutral. They knew, or at least they suspected. But in the Byzantine court, survival often meant silence. The culprit? Arsenic, mixed with honey. a favorite combination of assassins. The sweetness masked the metallic taste, giving it the appearance of fine vintage. It ensured the victim wouldn't recognize the danger until it was far too late. But this was no isolated case. The medieval world was full of such stories, each more twisted than the last, because these poisonings were rarely about personal hatred. They were about power. In 1521, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, a man with serious papal ambitions, was invited to the most important banquet of the year. The occasion? A celebration of a powerful new alliance among Italy's ruling families. It was the kind of gathering where men toasted with one hand and reached for daggers with the other. Medici's wine was laced with cantarella, a Renaissance-era poison made from a deadly blend of arsenic, vinegar, and pig's blood. As the feast continued, he began vomiting blood, his face turning pale, his breath shallow. But even in agony, he smiled, nodded politely, and tried to maintain appearances, because to show weakness in such a gathering could invite more than sympathy. It could invite your own downfall. He died before sunrise. His rivals? Untouched, pleased, victorious. The French court, never one to be outdone, approached assassination with scientific precision. When King Charles VI decided to rid himself of his meddlesome brother-in-law, the Count of Ero, he didn't send soldiers or declare war. He sent an invitation to dinner. The royal chefs outdid themselves. A feast of legendary opulence. The centerpiece? Roasted. As the Count savored every bite, he praised the seasoning, complimented the cooks, and laughed at the king's jokes. But beneath his laughter, his nervous system was unraveling. Within days, he was dead. Yet, his last words, reportedly, were still filled with praise for the meal that had killed him. Such was the brilliance and cruelty of a well-timed poison. It let the victim savor the moment, unaware that each bite brought them closer to the end. What these poisoners understood better than most kings, priests, or generals was psychology. They knew that pride would be their ally. Nobles didn't cry out. They didn't show weakness, especially not in front of others. That was the perfect moment to strike. To be poisoned at a public banquet wasn't just a death. It was a message, a warning to others, a demonstration of control, a performance. But not all deaths at the table were quiet. Not all betrayals whispered. Some screamed. In 1440, Scotland played host to one of the darkest chapters in the history of medieval hospitality, the Black Dinner. Two young boys, William Douglas, age 10, and his even younger brother David, were invited to dine at Edinburgh Castle by their protector, Sir William Crichton. It was meant to be a gesture of peace, a symbol of unity between powerful clans. The boys arrived wearing their finest clothes, smiling, perhaps excited to be part of the adult world of politics and power. But the moment they sat at the table, the mood changed. A bull's head, the traditional Scottish symbol of death, was placed on the table in front of them. A silent declaration, a sentence. Before the boys could react, Crichton's men seized them, dragging them from the hall to the courtyard. And there, under the stunned eyes of noble guests, the two children were beheaded. Their crime, being born into a family that Crichton viewed as a threat to his political ambitions. The guests remained. They finished their meal in silence, the image of those small bodies burned into their minds. No one dared protest, no one dared leave. Because in that moment, they realized the cost of challenging their host. In truth, Scotland was not alone in this grim tradition. Across Europe, wedding feasts, victory banquets, reconciliation dinners, all were repurposed as opportunities for elimination. In 1461, Edward IV of England hosted the Earl of Devon and his son, supposedly to mend old tensions after civil war. It seemed, for a moment, that peace might be possible. But halfway through the meal, Edward's soldiers surrounded the table. The father and son were executed before the second course had even cooled. Feasts had become tactical ambushes, where guests arrived unarmed and unprepared, lulled by music and the scent of roasted meat, only to be cut down by betrayal. To eat at a noble's table in the Middle Ages was to risk everything, and yet no one refused the invitation. To decline could be seen as cowardice, defiance, or even treason, so they came, again and again. Some survived, others didn't, but all knew one truth. In the medieval world, death didn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wore velvet sleeves, held a goblet, and said, "To your health." The medieval banquet was supposed to be a moment of unity, a time when enemies set aside grudges, when families toasted alliances, and when laughter echoed beneath vaulted ceilings. But in a world where ambition was sharper than any blade, even these sacred moments were not safe. Sometimes, poison was considered too slow, too uncertain. There were moments when a host wanted to send a clearer message, one that couldn't be mistaken for illness or accident. And so, the dagger was drawn openly. The blood was spilled where everyone could see it. The feast became a theater of fear. One of the most chilling examples of this took place in Scotland in the year 1440, at a banquet forever remembered as the Black Dinner. The story begins with William Douglas, a young boy of just 10 years old, and his even younger brother, David. They were heirs to the powerful Douglas clan, one of the most influential families in the kingdom. But power, as it often does, attracts enemies. Their supposed protector, Sir William Crichton, saw them not as children, but as threats. So he invited them to dine at Edinburgh Castle. Imagine the excitement of those two boys, dressed in fine clothes, cheeks flushed with youth, stepping into the grand hall with wide eyes and eager smiles. This was no ordinary meal. It was a celebration, a moment of honor. The hall was lit with torches. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and spiced bread. Music drifted through the air. For a moment, it must have felt like a dream. And then, everything changed. Without a word, the servants placed a bull's head on the center of the table, a Scottish symbol of death. It was not a dish. It was a sentence. The music stopped. The laughter died. Before the boys could ask what it meant, Crichton's soldiers moved in. The young Douglases were dragged from the table, still confused, still innocent. And in the castle courtyard, beneath the cold gray sky, they were beheaded. Their crime? Being born into a family that Crichton feared. Back inside, the guests remained seated, some in shock, some in silent approval. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The message was clear. Loyalty was demanded, and rebellion would be answered, not with exile, not with negotiation, but with the sword, even if it meant killing children. The guests finished their meal in haunted silence. It was not the first time blood had been spilled at a banquet, and it would not be the last. England, too, had its own version of the High Table Massacre. In 1461, during the brutal years of the Wars of the Roses, King Edward IV invited the Earl of Devon and his son to a reconciliation feast. The war had torn the country apart, families divided, loyalties shattered. This dinner, it seemed, was a chance to start anew, but Edward had other plans. The warning signs were subtle. The unusually armed servants, the noticeable absence of other high-ranking nobles. And then, as the guests raised their goblets, the trap was sprung. Soldiers surrounded the table, steel drawn. The father and son were executed right there in the hall. The wine was still breathing. It was not war, it was not a duel, it was a message. But perhaps no events showed the twisted brilliance of such tactics more than what happened at wedding feasts. Occasions meant to celebrate love, family, and the joining of two houses. You may have heard of the Red Wedding, made famous in fiction, but medieval history had real red weddings, and they were just as cruel. At such events, guests arrived unarmed, dressed in ceremonial attire. They came in peace, they came with hope, and so they were at their most vulnerable. And that's when betrayal struck. The bride would become a widow before she danced, the groom a corpse before the first toast. No one saw it coming. No one could escape. Because in that moment, amid laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses, no one expected death. For the nobles of the Middle Ages, learning to read a table was as important as reading a battlefield. The seating arrangement, the proximity to the host, the dishes served, all of it carried meaning. And the cruelest paradox? The closer you sat to your host, the greater the danger. It was a twisted game of trust and power. If you were at the far end of the table, perhaps you were unimportant or safe, but if your host placed you by his side, poured your wine himself, laughed at your jokes, you might be dead by dessert. No one played this game better than King John of England. In 1208, he invited his once loyal ally, William de Braose, and his family to a feast at Corfe Castle. Their history ran deep. Battles fought together, secrets shared, laughter traded over countless meals. But then William's wife dared to question the suspicious death of the king's nephew. That was enough. John welcomed them with open arms, shared memories, toasted to friendship. And then he raised his goblet one final time. Not to offer a pardon, but to declare them traitors. There were no executions that night. That would have been too swift, too merciful. Instead, John imprisoned the entire family in the dungeons beneath the castle, directly beneath the dining hall. While the king continued to host banquets above, their cries echoed below, fading slowly with each passing day as they starved to death in the dark. The message? Even friendship could be fatal. This was the terrible brilliance of medieval betrayal. It wasn't just about killing, it was about breaking the spirit, about proving that no oath, no alliance, no bloodline could protect you, not if you sat at the wrong table. By the late Middle Ages, accepting a dinner invitation required not only etiquette, but courage. Because in this world, the most dangerous thing wasn't the sword you could see. It was the smile of the host, the warmth of the fire, the golden glint of wine. And as the goblet was lifted for a final toast, more than one guest must have wondered, will this be my last supper?
Not all betrayals came with blood spilled in the courtyard or poison in the wine. Some came with shared memories, whispered secrets, and the soft clink of goblets raised in trust. In the grand game of medieval politics, friendship was a dangerous luxury, and the most fatal betrayals came not from enemies in armor, but from allies seated right beside you, laughing at your jokes. Nowhere was this truer than in the Byzantine court, a place as beautiful as it was brutal. The corridors of Constantinople's palaces echoed not only with prayers and hymns, but with schemes woven over long dinners and intimate conversations. In 1078, Emperor Michael VII, Ducas, found himself leaning more and more on a trusted military commander named Nikephoros Botaniatis. They dined together often, discussed military strategy, drank fine wine, and even exchanged gifts. There was no reason to suspect anything. After all, what kind of traitor brings toys for your children? But behind that affable mask, Nikephoros was plotting. Slowly, methodically, he bribed the palace guards. He memorized every corridor, every weak point in the emperor's defenses. And one evening, not long after their final shared meal, Michael was overthrown, not by an army from afar, not by a sword in the night, but by the man who had eaten at his table for months. The pain, perhaps, wasn't just the loss of power. It was the realization that he'd been sharing wine with his executioner. This kind of betrayal wasn't rare. In the courts of Europe, lords and kings learned that the closer someone sat at your table, the deeper they could drive a knife into your back. The tragedy was, there was no simple solution. To govern, you needed allies. You needed counsel, conversation, company. But to let someone in, truly in, was to hand them the map to your vulnerabilities. They would know what wine you preferred, when you relaxed, what subjects made you pause and think, where your mind wandered when you let your guard down. To break bread was to open your soul, and if that bread was blessed, as tradition demanded, it made the betrayal all the more cruel. By the late medieval period, people began to say, only half in jest, "Better to sleep beside your sword than beside your friend." Perhaps no family embodied the art of dinner table betrayal more than the Borgias. Though they operated during the Renaissance, their methods were simply the perfection of what medieval poisoners had practiced for centuries. Cesare Borgia didn't invent the poisoned feast. He refined it. By the time he and his father, Pope Alexander VI, came to power, the techniques of medieval assassination were already well known and well documented. Killers knew which mushrooms mimicked heart failure. They knew how to grind glass into a fine powder that would slice a victim's intestines slowly, invisibly. They had perfected poisons that took days to kill, just long enough for the victim to die in bed, looking for all the world like someone who had simply fallen ill. And for those unfortunate enough to sit across from the Borgias at dinner, death was served with a smile. But this dance of death didn't begin with the Borgias. It began far earlier, with cases like that of Pope John VIII, who died in 882 AD, long before the Renaissance dawned. His killers chose a particularly vicious method. He was served wine laced with ground glass and slow-acting toxins. For days, he felt worse and worse, tired, weak, plagued by stomach pain. He blamed age, stress, perhaps even divine punishment. In truth, his digestive tract was being torn apart from the inside, a silent agony that medieval medicine couldn't explain or cure. He died confused, his killers untouched. There were no fingerprints, no blood, no screams, only silence. And as time passed, the fear deepened. By the 14th and 15th centuries, paranoia became ritual. Nobles no longer dined without precautions. Tasters were hired, servants who took the first bite or sip of every dish, their lives reduced to a line of defense. Some lords carried secret antidotes sewn into their sleeves. Others demanded that each servant eat a portion of the food they delivered. But poisoners were clever. They adapted. They changed ingredients, dosages, timing. They could kill a man slowly, days after the meal, sometimes even weeks later, so no suspicion would fall on the feast. In many ways, these assassins were ahead of their time, masters of chemistry, psychology, and politics all at once. What made these betrayals so devastating wasn't just the physical pain. It was the emotional betrayal, the realization that hospitality had been turned into a weapon. There was a sacred tradition in the medieval world. When a guest accepted bread and salt from a host, they entered into a covenant, a divine agreement. From that moment on, the host was bound to protect them no matter what. It was a beautiful custom. It brought a sense of safety, of shared humanity. But it also made the betrayal more devastating, because when a host chose to break that oath, to kill a man who had trusted him, eaten his food, praised his wine, it wasn't just murder, it was sacred. And that, perhaps, is what made it so effective. One of the most tragic examples of this comes from 1066, not long before the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The legendary Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, had survived dozens of battles. He was a warrior, a tactician. He trusted no one. But when Earl Tostig, an old ally, invited him to a private feast to discuss strategy, Harold let his guard drop, just for one night. He believed the old traditions would protect him, that once he stepped into Tostig's hall and shared a meal, he would be safe. But Tostig had already betrayed him, selling information about his location to the enemy, King Harold Godwinson. Harold escaped that night, but the intelligence gathered during that meal led directly to his death weeks later. Sometimes the dagger wasn't in the wine. Sometimes it was in the words shared across the table. To the medieval noble, every meal was a gamble. And as cups were raised and candles flickered low, more than one guest must have sat in silence, watching the host carefully, wondering, is this the face of a friend or my future killer? By the late medieval period, assassination by poison was no longer a crude act of desperation. It had become an art form. Gone were the days of hastily crushed herbs or clumsy toxins. In their place came measured doses, layered effects, and a precise understanding of the human body. The banquet table became a kind of operating theater, only instead of scalpels, the hands wielded goblets. Instead of anesthesia, the victim was lulled by warm conversation and the glow of candlelight. And when the poison struck, it did so not in fury, but with grace. The families who mastered this deadly craft didn't see themselves as murderers. They were craftsmen, curators of death, and no family danced more elegantly with death than the Borgias. Though technically Renaissance in timeline, the Borgias were the inheritors of medieval murder, born from centuries of perfected technique. What the Middle Ages began with powdered arsenic and tainted wine, Cesare Borgia and his kin elevated into a symphony of silent slaughter. They understood that killing wasn't just about elimination. It was about timing, about symbolism, about sending a message without ever raising your voice. They didn't need swords. They had dinner parties. But centuries before the Borgias, the groundwork had already been laid. By the 1300s, medieval poisoners knew which mushrooms would mimic heart attacks, which metals would slowly rot a man from the inside, and which combinations of herbs could make a noble drop dead weeks after a single, unremarkable meal. Mercury was used not just to destroy the body, but to imitate natural decline. A nobleman who seemed merely ill, not murdered. Antimony caused the heart to fail. Snake venom, carefully dried and mixed into wine, left behind no clear trace at all. And still, the guests came. One of the earliest recorded poisonings of a pope, Pope John VIII in the year 882, offers a glimpse into just how cruel this practice could be. The poisoners didn't want speed, they wanted suffering. So they laced his wine with ground glass, which shredded his insides over days. They added plant-based toxins that slowed his digestion and mimicked the symptoms of divine punishment. The Pope grew weaker with each passing day, convinced he was dying of age or stress, not treachery. By the time death took him, his assassins had long vanished into the shadows. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, only silence. And in the silence, the tradition deepened. It became so common, so ritualized, that noble households developed entire systems of protection. Some had official tasters, men who risked their lives at every meal. Others demanded that servants eat first, under watchful eyes. The most paranoid rulers went further still, traveling with their own alchemists and antidotes, hidden in rings, cuffs, or hollowed-out brooches. And yet, for every layer of defense, poisoners found a way around it. They adapted faster than the courts could respond. They learned to lace only the last sip of wine, or to use ingredients that took effect only after digestion was complete. To them, killing was a science. What made this era so chilling wasn't just the murders themselves, it was how beautifully masked they were. The host would bless the bread, as was tradition. He would pour wine generously, ask about your family, tell stories from his youth. He would laugh with you, sit beside you, and then, as your limbs grew numb, as your heart stuttered in your chest, he would meet your eyes with sympathy, never breaking the illusion of care. Because in medieval culture, the ritual of hospitality, and that's what made it the perfect weapon. Once you broke bread with a man, you were under his protection. It was more than a rule, it was a divine covenant. And so, when a host chose to break that bond, it wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. And still, they did it, again and again. Because betrayal delivered with grace was often more powerful than any army. So imagine the scene, a long table lit by flickering candles, the clink of silverware, the hum of a lute in the corner, guests laughing politely, their eyes betraying a flicker of unease, the host smiling warmly, toasts being raised, and somewhere among those golden goblets, one contains death. Maybe it's yours, maybe it's the man across from you, but in this world, you drink anyway, because to refuse the toast is an insult. To show fear is weakness, and to leave early, well, no one leaves early. By the end of the medieval period, dining had become a dance with death. Each meal a silent wager, each course a calculated risk, and so the wise learned to eat slowly, to trust no one, and to pray. Because in a world where trust could be fatal, the goblet in your hand might be the last thing you ever hold. By now, you might be wondering, why did they keep going? Why did the nobles of medieval Europe, knowing full well the risks, continue to accept invitations, raise their glasses, and sit at tables where death might be the next course served? The answer isn't just fear. It's not even pride. It's power. In the brutal world of medieval politics, to be seen at a banquet meant everything. It showed confidence, control, strength. Declining an invitation, even from a rival, could be interpreted as an admission of guilt, of weakness, of vulnerability. It could cost alliances, spark suspicion, begin wars. So they went, even when they sensed danger, even when the wine smelled strange, or the laughter at the table felt too tight. They smiled, they ate, they toasted, and in doing so, they upheld a performance that was older than any kingdom, older than any crown, the illusion of trust. Because that's what it was, in the end, a grand illusion. Hosts and guests played their roles as if on a stage. The goblet, the feast, the music, the words of welcome, all carefully arranged, just like props in a play. But the tragedy wasn't written in ink or parchment. It was written in arsenic and betrayal. And when the curtain fell, there was no applause, only silence. This wasn't a world where enemies struck from the shadows. It was a world where your murderer might kiss your cheek before dessert, where your most dangerous moment wasn't on the battlefield, but in the warmth of someone's hall, seated beside a fire, holding a cup of wine, where a smile could mean mercy or murder. So the medieval banquet became a paradox, a place of joy and terror, a ritual of connection and of destruction. A reminder that in a world built on fragile loyalties, even hospitality could be weaponized. And perhaps that's why these stories still haunt us. Because the fear they carry is timeless. It isn't about poison, it's about trust, about betrayal, about the quiet, terrifying realization that the person who knows you best might also be the one who ends you. And yet, they kept raising their goblets, because in the end, the nobles of the Middle Ages understood one thing better than most. It's better to die with dignity at the high table than to live in the shadows, forgotten. To raise your glass with steady hands, to meet your host's eyes without blinking. And if it is your last toast, to drink deeply, to die beautifully, to let them say he did not flinch. So tonight, as you sip your own drink, safe, unseen, untouched by courtly politics, remember this: there was a time when every shared meal was a gamble, when wine tasted like loyalty, and every feast could be your last. Cheers to those who never saw the dagger coming,